Grandpa's funeral took place today. Although the ceremony went well, it did nothing to console me. I feel empty. Lost. Returning to the mansion offers me no comfort. It's cold, distant, as though it rebels at my very presence.
Nowadays, Silicon Knight is most well known for getting crushed by Epic following their lawsuit over Too Human, but back in the day they started to first gain notoriety through Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain. Following this game, Nintendo would buy partial ownership of Silicon Knights and get them to make games exclusively for them. In the end, they made 2 before Silicon Knights jumped ship, and that's where the story of Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem begins. Firstly developed for the N64, but later made a launch title for the Gamecube, then made a game that came to the Gamecube. Despite poor sales, the game would develop a cult following. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem is the story of a Lovecraftian battle of the gods as told through the Tome of Eternal Darkness, a book recording the tales of various chosen ones through the ages. As such, despite the framing of the story being centered on Alex Roivas, a girl looking to solve her grandfather's murder, the game will jump around in time and location as she finds pages and reads through the various chapters. The tome itself acts mysteriously, but seems to be delivering itself to people it believes can help it prevent the Eternal Darkness, the manifesting of one of the gods, either Ulyaoth, Chattur'gha, or Xel'lotath, to the physical reality. Due to the layout of the narrative, the time, setting, and characters change with every chapter, each containing a mini-story for the character and a small-sized story for the locations between chapters. We'll cover this in depth shortly, but I will say I think the story is generally well done, interesting, and well acted. Fans of Metal Gear will likely recognize a lot of the cast, such as David Hayter and Jennifer Hale, who were allegedly used solely because Silicon Knights already had access to them through their work on Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. Eternal Darkness' gameplay takes a heavy cue from that of its horror game predecessors like Resident Evil. At times the game is almost an adventure game, trading out combat for exploring and puzzle solving, not just in Alex's interludes, but in sections throughout most levels. There's a lot of inventory puzzles that make use of the environment and magic system to keep the player guessing. Many of the game's environments seem to be or are pre-rendered, and while the camera is fixed in most instances, it will also move around slightly to accommodate movement, which adds to the game's cinematic qualities. While the combat isn't particularly engaging, it tries with its limb-based targeting system. Aiming at arms can prevent an enemy from attacking, while removing its head blinds it and may cause it to flail around and attack its allies. The best part of combat is slowly discovering the quickest elimination method for enemies, such as regular zombies being headed into body then down instantly. The game has a variety of weapons, basically split into swords and ranged weapons. To the game's credit, even between the swords they have vastly different speeds and power, and the ranged weapons have far more variety as they span thousands of years of technology, from a blowgun to an assault rifle. The game's magic system is a mix of combat, puzzle solving, and protection tools. The game has 12 spells, all of which can be cast in the sign of any of the main 3 ancients, and 9 of which can be used under the secret 4th sign. These spells range from healing for the 3 meters I'll discuss in a moment, shields, buffs, offensive spells, enemy summons, or simple puzzle tools like revealing hidden objects. Each spell can be cast in various power levels, 3, 5, or 7, which creates a good risk-reward system where more powerful spells take longer to complete and moving or taking damage cancels the spell, but not its magic consumption. At times, this can make encounters very tense, especially when it comes to healing. Furthermore, the magic system is used in a rock, paper, scissors fashion, with Chattur'gha, red, beating Xel'lotath, green, which in turn beats Ulyaoth, blue, which then loops around to defeating red, with the hidden element having strange and unique properties. I personally remembered it because it's effectively the fire, grass, water cycle from Pokemon, although in this case the elements are life, sanity, and magic. Life is self-explanatory, as is magic, although unlike life, magic restores by moving around, although sanity is a bit different. Sanity is the game's most standout element. Encounters with enemies and certain other events will lower sanity, and it can only be raised by finishing down enemies or spending magic. As the character's sanity lowers, there's chances the games will create sanity effects. These begin with odd noises, but slowly begin to bleed into the meta. Characters can be killed by their own spells before being revived seconds later, walk on ceilings, or even face what appears to be glitches, falling through the floor, getting stuck in walls, and others that are so good I won't even risk ruining them. They can come off as downright cruel, especially early on when the player is unsure of what to expect. The first time I used a healing spell and exploded, I was completely shocked at the thought of losing a bunch of progress before it set in what was going on. A big part of the fun of the game is balancing sanity, remaining low enough to see the cool stuff without sinking so low as to lose health. Sanity Effects are a genius method of immersion as they create confusion and paranoia in the player, and it's simply brilliant. It's also worth briefly noting that every playable character has slightly different attributes. While nothing major, they will have minor differences in the size of their health, magic, and sanity, as well as stamina, which affects run speed and duration. The game strikes a really good balance between its exploration and puzzle solving elements, and it's mostly decent combat. But the exploration shines a lot brighter. Puzzles will often span multiple rooms, items, and small clues and descriptions to piece together. And the game's way of returning to expanded versions of old areas while constantly drip feeding new spells makes it all the more satisfying. Puzzles like bathing a corroded necklace in acid alongside the pre-rendered backgrounds give the game a strong 90s adventure game vibes that I think play nicely with its Lovecraftian world. I'm happy to say that the game plays very smoothly. While the game is slow-paced, it feels so purposefully, and it never feels stiff. Even those opposed to fixed or semi-fixed cameras will likely have no problem due to how well it controls, and probably also it not having tank controls. Making L the run button is surprisingly comfortable, and despite how weird the lock-on system may seem given the camera, regardless of positioning, it's always left for left arm, right for right arm. Every ounce of the Gamecube controller is used, and it seems there was a lot of thought put into every button placement, with one exception. For reasons I don't quite understand, B does everything. A is on attack, so B being examined is fine, but while selecting options is done with A, picking up items is done with B, which just feels so wrong for a good portion of the playtime. My only other major control gripe is the somewhat cluttered pause menu, which is used a lot. The inventory can't be manually rearranged, but enchanting an item moves it to the front of the stack. The mix and change commands are only used 2 or 3 times each, and it's all a little much. Although having to use items from the menu is something I like, as it reduces the chances of just mashing B to solve puzzles. The map doesn't give nearly enough information to be helpful, such as a direction indicator, and has confusing controls. Finally, the spell menu is unnecessarily cluttered as well. There's a spell list with all 12 spells laid out, with options for casting, assigning as a quick command, or reading a description. After choosing cast, the player also needs to pick a size and alignment for the spell. Spells that affect items like enchant also require picking an item. Crafting spells is a cool idea in concept, but it's usually more tedious than it's worth. Once a spell's made in a certain size, regardless of alignment, it can be cast in any alignment, but the same isn't true for size, which need to be recreated every time a new circle is obtained to keep up with the difficulty curve. It's not even like the spell changes, it's the same 2 ingredients, but with power runes spammed to fill the dead space. The quick select menu also only exists to remind players of their presets, which probably could have fit better somewhere else. Despite that, I think the control is very good, and not just for its time, but in general. The game's design has some incredible moments that facilitate player discovery. Without hand-holding, there's subtle leading everywhere in the game. In the first room at the start of the game, the only thing in sight is the clock. And when it's interacted with, Alex not only gets a specific number to keep in mind, but gets a key, prompting them to check their inventory, where they'll see a second floor key which will break when used. After finding the second clock, the player should draw a connection if they haven't examined the first clock already, but there's also various seeds planted here too. Once the player gets the spell that fixes items, they'll realize that they can fix the second floor key, which will lead them to the dresser that they can't find the keyhole in. But as before, lessons in the chapters are used to guide in the interlude, so when they find another spell that helps find invisible things, they'll automatically understand what to do with the drawer, and so on. It's clear a lot of thought went into teaching players and guiding players without being intrusive, although it's clear that sometimes the developers couldn't find a clever way to guide the player and just left notes behind. To briefly touch on difficulty, it's also surprisingly well done. The game is incredibly soft until the player gets spells, at which point they can heal, cast shield, or very late into the game cast magic pool, which is a constant refilling of the various effects over time, which the game returns with more difficult scenarios. There are times where the game is guilty of just throwing a bunch of enemies together, and there can be some cascading failure combos in those areas, but besides the back half of a certain chapter, it's usually not that extreme. Some enemies like horror can be really tough at first, but learning their weaknesses makes them more consistent for the most part. There's a really good progression in the exploration puzzle half too, as the game builds on and expands areas to create familiarity and recognition, while still bringing new things to the table and slowly upping the complexity involved, partially as a result of this expansion. The game also has what can loosely be called a difficulty system in its 3 routes. While I'll cover these more shortly, the main gist is that the chosen route is which ancient the villain teams up with, and the magical attacks of the minions of that ancient drain from the corresponding elements, health, magic, or sanity, making Chattur'gha the most difficult due to enemies effectively just hitting harder, where Ulyaoth and Xel'lotath are roughly even, as sanity and magic are resources with far less lasting impact. The game's reliance solely on manual saves also allows the player to judge how much progress they lose, and the saving is really quick, meaning save scumming is a viable option for people who are bad like myself, although the game won't allow saving in rooms that the characters could potentially die in, ones with living enemies or traps. There's a really solid aesthetic to the game too. The character models are solid for the time, and each character is very visually distinct from one another. There's obviously a lot of thought put into the characters on every level, from look to sound to characterization. The environments are a step above though. They have the perfect unnaturalness, but also strangely aesthetic quality that pre-renders excel at. Because the game repeatedly returns to areas, they all have strong visual designs and layouts, and are filled with subtle touches and details, like the floor faces in the Tome of Eternal Darkness' chamber. In an amazing move of foresight, the game also supports 16:9 widescreen natively in 2002. And better yet, it seems the game was made for widescreen first. It has absolutely no issues running in full screen. The one drawback is that the pre-rendered cutscenes are all still in standard definition, so as not to have to fit them on the disc twice or cut them off in standard mode. The sound design is also fantastic, and I imagine even better in surround sound. Knocks, screams, and crying constantly fill the air when low on sanity. There's satisfying sounds for the dismemberment, and even all the guns make their own unique noises. Even enemies have their own unique sounds, which helps identify them and can really add to the tension when there's noises of something bad just outside of the frame. The soundtrack is passable. There's a few decent tracks, but a lot of it is pretty subdued for the most part, which does fit with the aesthetic of the game, but I do like a little bit livelier tracks. The piano song is pretty slick though. I don't know if that's from a classical piece or something else. I don't know a lot about music, but I do like that one a lot. Now real quick here, I'd like to say spoilers from here on. There will be another bigger spoiler warning later, but Eternal Darkness is really good and worth playing to see it unfold firsthand, especially with the Sanity Effects and the like. While I will touch on level design and such, I mostly want to cover the story and character beats, as explaining puzzles and whacking a zombie repeatedly isn't incredibly engaging. The game has a very cliche beginning. Alex Roivas dreams of fighting zombies. I think this dream ties into a later event, but it's probably just to have a little action at the start before the exploration comes on. The next day, Alex is called to her family manor in a frankly hilarious scene where she's asked to identify her dead grandfather, despite having no head and essentially being a bloody puddle.
Miss Roivas, is that your grandfather, Edward?
Yes, it's him.
It's probably the worst handled moment in the game, but may be explained by Inspector Legrasse, the detective, being planned as a boss at some point, who is a bone thief in disguise. So his weirdness may stem from that scrapped idea. After the initial start, the gameplay section of A Death in the Family begins. No combat, just a few doors and interactable elements. Exploring Roivas Mansion is great. It's large enough to hide secrets, but not so large as to make it a maze. While Alex can't access the second floor immediately, there's still a few spots open, and Alex can even find some pieces for later interludes early to get a head start on figuring out their uses. After solving a small puzzle with the house's clocks, a secret passage opens, and Alex is introduced to the Tome of Eternal Darkness. As I said before, each chapter of the game is another section of the book, and after each chapter, an Alex interlude begins, where she searches the ever-expanding mansion for the missing chapter pages to continue reading. The game's proper beginning, the Chosen One, takes us back to 26 BC in control of Pius Augustus, a Roman centurion tasked with finding a mysterious artifact in the Persian desert by Caesar. Voices call out to him, leading him to the Forbidden City, a temple of sorts underground. While probably intended to become the first bearer of the Tome of Eternal Darkness, he instead stumbles into the essences of the Ancient. The player is given the ability to choose, and when Pius interacts with his chosen essence, he's killed and turned into a skeletal zombie, now a pious servant of his chosen Ancient, which will have minor effects throughout the game. Cutscenes have slight alterations, primarily in the ones that are interactions between him and his chosen Ancient.
Master, I bring thee grave news. The colony of Guardians in the ruins of Engar has been decimated. Without them, I fear we are lost.
Your fears are unfounded, servant.
Master, I am saddened to report the destruction of the Guardian colony at the ruin of Engar.
I am not without eyes, servant. I knew of their loss as it happened.
Do you bring news of disaster, Augustus?
And if not, we wonder why not, since disaster has struck.
Yes. Your colony of Guardians in the ruins of Engar has been eradicated. A great magic wrought massive destruction there.
Enemies will have slight variance in look abilities, and their magic will drain different meters, and the order the player characters obtain their powers in will be slightly changed. The level itself mostly does basic combat and puzzle tutorializing, but there is an interesting moment. The limb targeting mechanic is taught to Pius on a statue, and in the tome's pocket dimension, Pius' statue is only legs, meaning this seems to be a metaphorical death for Pius, where he is fully given into the Ancients, and implying he was supposed to find the tome to stop them before they can move. The only enemies in this chapter are regular zombies, and due to it coming before the choice in Ancient, it's the same in every playthrough. The intermission between the first chapter and the second, The Binding of the Corpse God, is about 10 seconds long, as the second chapter will just spawn behind Alex. The only thing of note is that finishing a chapter will set Alex's sanity meter to various levels, slowly reducing it to almost nothing by the end of the game. Chapter 2 jumps ahead to the year 1150 in Cambodia. Elia, a dancing slave girl, is in possession of the tome before the chapter starts, which is unusual. Before the chapter begins, Pius seals a being called Mantarok the Corpse God in the recently built Khmer temple of Angkor Thom, an event already recorded in the Tome of Eternal Darkness. When she enters the temple, it seals and she begins exploring. The puzzles in the first area are all related to lighting candles to match the appropriate time of day, and after finding a blowgun, she's dropped to the bottom floor. The bottom floor is mostly combat and booby trap dodging, and if Elia can't save the priest, she'll only have the blowgun, which despite inflicting poison is pretty bad. It also introduces stronger red zombies that can regrow their limbs and take more damage, while blue zombies explode when they take damage, and green zombies can replace their limbs with green energy. Various murals depict Mantarok with the Khmers being worshipped as a benevolent harvest god. It's interesting to see as the other ancients are blatantly bad and planning to destroy the world. Eventually Elia meets Mantarok, sealed and dying due to Pius reversing his own magic on him. At the same time, Mantarok's magic is also sealing the other ancients, which is apparently a holdover from when there were 5 ancients, 1 in power and 1 weakened, although I find that it's a surprisingly good dynamic that he's both too weak to do much and still using his powers to fuck the other ancients. Pius also ridicules Mantarok for stooping to the level of eating humans, another hint that he's somewhat benevolent despite his mantle as the corpse god. Pius attacks Elia, but some Khmer gives her Mantarok's essence to protect it, reviving her and keeping it from Pius. Incapable of getting the location of the essence from her, he kills her as the chapter ends, a good show of the kind of Vader-esque character Pius can be. Alex's next interlude involves her doing the same candle puzzle as Elia's chapter, but without any evolution, so it really only serves to reinforce the idea that what happens in the chapter will be used again in the interlude. Chapter 3, Suspicions of Conspiracy, takes place in the year 814 in Amiens, France, in the Oubliette Cathedral. It follows Anthony, the messenger of Charlemagne the Frank, who is visiting the church. A strange monk gives Anthony a scroll to give to Charlemagne, telling him not to look, and when Anthony looks, he's cursed, realizing that there's a plot against his master. This curse plays a role throughout the chapter, slowly zombifying Anthony, which not only impedes his movement eventually, but causes him to become immortal. Falling in battle causes him to revive with full health instantly, so technically it's the easiest chapter. The door where Charlemagne is having his meeting is locked, and Anthony must find the bishop to get the key, and at the same time a priest in the order has mysteriously died. After Anthony tastelessly rips open his coffin, he discovers something is truly amiss, as the dead priest has a giant hole in his body. Now we not only have a mystery, but the indication that the church is completely under Pius's thumb. Anthony is the first character to receive a spell after going to the Tomes dimension, with its amazing screaming face floor that's very unnerving. Enchant item can be used to repair items as well as power up weapons, always dealing more damage, but even more to the submissive ancient as described earlier, although Anthony will only have the rune weak to Pius's ancient here. This spell is used to repair various jars for a puzzle to reach the bishop's secret chamber. Anthony can also get the two-handed sword for saving a monk, which may be the best weapon in the game, downing most zombies in 1 or 2 hits. The bishop's chamber is a monument to Pius's chosen ancient, and after killing him, Anthony can finally go save Charlemagne. A new enemy is introduced here, the Trapper, which is a small scorpion-like creature that can pull characters into the Trapper dimension, which despite being annoying has healing areas for all 3 meters, and therefore can sometimes be useful. Trappers are mostly blind and can be avoided by crouch walking or killed with ranged attacks. Before reaching Charlemagne, Anthony is also attacked by a Horror, the largest regular enemy, which hits pretty hard and has magical attacks that drain the meter associated with their ancient. Removing all 3 of the Horror's heads or eyes is enough to take it down in most cases. When Anthony reaches Charlemagne, he realizes that he's too late and Anthony is killed by Pius before an enemy called a Bone Thief bursts from a priest's chest, which I'll elaborate on soon. This chapter is actually really good. It's the game's first level that doesn't seem too much like a tutorial, and it feels pretty tense, especially as there's no indication that Anthony is invincible, while also showing the surprisingly decent combat and introducing basic puzzle solving mechanics. Returning to Alex, she can now go to the second floor by repairing the key she has after learning the spell from Anthony's chapter, showing a more clever use of teaching in chapters and reinforcing in intermissions than last chapter. Chapter 4, The Gift of Forever, returns to Persia, now about 600 years later in the year 565. The Forbidden City is now more weathered than before, and our new character Kareem is searching for an artifact that has been calling out to his love Chandra in her dreams. In case it isn't apparent, this is more meddling from the ancients. This chapter is very exploration heavy. While Pius's portion of the Forbidden City is revisited, it's only the last portion of Kareem's chapter, a running theme between these revisited areas. It seems that Pius has partially made this area his own, as it's filled with zombies, horrors, and a new enemy, Bone Thieves, which are similar to skinwalkers, stealing human bodies that when destroyed, the Bone Thieves pop out of. Bone Thieves are very aggressive and can even do instant kills from a grapple, stealing the bodies of the player characters, although they're very vulnerable to headshots, save for the green ones which lack heads. Kareem also gains the incredibly useful Recover spell, which restores the meter of the matching alignment when cast, allowing Kareem to maintain sanity and health, although since it costs magic to cast, it's not much help for magic. Kareem is also the first character with a ranged weapon, the Chakram, although the Chakrams are fairly mediocre and limited. While puzzles are limited in this chapter, the enchant item spell gets a new use here. The Ruby Effigy is also hidden here, and while useless right now, will become somewhat helpful later. Finally, Kareem reaches the chamber where Pius died. Kareem claims the same ancient essence that Pius chose for later use before being approached by a ghost. In his absence, his love has died and become a ghost, and asks him to become a ghost with her in order to protect the essence from the dark forces, an offer he reluctantly takes. While this seems innocent enough, these ghosts and guardians are crucial to later events, but that's to be saved for our later return to Persia. Also interesting note, but Kareem was not intended to be in this game. His chapter is actually a hasty inclusion used to replace the chapter of Joseph de Molay, a knight in the Crusades. Obviously, post 9/11 was not a good time for Crusade talk. Despite this, Kareem's chapter doesn't feel out of place in the slightest, and is integrated very well into the story. The next interlude starts with an inherent sanity effect that's really funny. That's all it is, it's really funny. The next chapter is again hidden behind something first used in the prior chapter with the enchant item spell by enchanting weapons. The Lurking Horde takes place in a familiar location, the Roivas mansion that the interludes take place in the year 1770. With Maximilian Roivas, ancestor of Alex. At this time the mansion is more lively, disrepair hasn't set in and many servants roam the building working on upkeep, but certain areas don't exist yet, such as the library. Max is a doctor, with his main attribute being fat, which reduces his stamina. He also has a flintlock pistol, which can shoot once before reload, and most importantly, he's a doctor, which allows him to perform autopsies on enemies he kills for short lore entries in the game's pause menu. His research into the Tome of Eternal Darkness, which he has heard about through a friend, has begun giving a strange atmosphere to his mansion, and while things begin normal, it slowly becomes apparent there are bone thieves among his staff. Max already has the tome in his possession, although it's hidden in a secret passage, which also contains a new spell, Reveal Invisible, which is fairly self-explanatory, but has an extra effect when used with the secret alignment. Max's segment is fairly straightforward and combat heavy, and he will recover the final alignment room for the dominant ancient. After draining the well, Max finds out that his manor is built on top of an ancient city, Nga, a city built inside of a gigantic 9-point magical circle, and fights a guardian, an enemy that varies wildly based on its master, with the Chattur'gha guardian being a chimera-like beast, the Ulyaoth guardian being a legless floating entity, and Xel'lotath's beast being 2 bodies with no head. Max goes to warn the world of the incoming danger, but a certain incident we'll return to soon has him declared insane as he spends the rest of his days in an insane asylum, so at least he survives his chapter. While the chapter itself isn't insanely engaging due to its emphasis on combat, the story here really begins to fill in the blanks of the background in the mansion, which more than makes up for it. The dresser key, available as far back as the prologue, now finally sees use. As with the Reveal Invisible spell, Alex can finally access the dresser for the next chapter, A Journey into Darkness. We return to Cambodia, the same temple, now completely overrun and lost to time in the 800 years preceding, in the year 1983. Edwin Lindsay is an Indiana Jones type character, a thrill-seeking archaeologist with a quick gun. He guides an eccentric artifact collector to the temple who turns out to be Pius in disguise, who apparently forgot how to reach the temple. Where Ellie skipped from the top floor to the bottom, Lindsay needs to go floor to floor by retrieving the various jewelries of the goddesses while dodging traps and solving puzzles. The focus on exploration puzzle solving is really refreshing, especially as most are inventory puzzles such as swapping the needed bracelet for a junk bracelet just like in Indiana Jones, or cleaning a necklace in acid. Lindsay also gains the Dispel magic spell early on, which is primarily used to remove magical shields from certain enemies, and the magical field spell, which creates a damaging barrier to enemies. He also encounters a new enemy, the Gatekeeper, which also varies depending on its ancient, with Chattur'gha and Xel'lotath being a winged skeleton and Ulyaoth lacking legs. The Gatekeepers cause high sanity loss regardless of ancient, and are only vulnerable from behind or when opening their wings. Lindsay also has a unique mechanic, a dusting brush he can use to remove cobwebs and reveal hidden objects. After going through the first floor that Elliot went through, he has a few unique floors before finally reaching the bottom where Elliot had been. In the basement, Lindsay also gets the Summon Trapper spell, which is self-explanatory, but he can use this particular summon to retrieve the 4th alignment, Mantarok, which tends to have unique effects. Enchanted items under Mantarok have a poison status effect. Recover heals both health and sanity. Reveal invisible makes the character invisible, allowing fights to be dodged. Dispel magic and damage field work on all alignments, and due to his binding, any summon spell cannot be used under Mantarok's sign. Mantarok's sign is generally incredibly useful. Upon reaching Mantarok, Pius also arrives, realizing that Mantarok is still alive as his essence is continuing to sustain him. Lindsay encounters the zombified Elia, who, as commanded by Mantarok, has been waiting for a successor to give his essence to. Lindsay takes the essence of Mantarok and eventually brings it to the leading researcher of the topic, Alex's grandfather Edward. Edward hides it, allowing Alex to find it right after. Unlike most bearers of the tomb, Lindsay then proceeds to leave the story alive and well, and as such never appears in the tome's dimension. This chapter is a really good blend of exploration, puzzles, and action, and may well be the best chapter in the game, but maybe that's the biased Indiana Jones fan in me. Alex can now claim Mantarok's essence, hidden right where Edward left it, and afterwards can dispel the barrier around the stained glass window to start the next chapter. Heresy! With an exclamation point. The chapter returns to the church in France in 1485 during the Spanish Inquisition. Lost in the rain, the monk Paul Luther arrives seeking shelter in the recently expanded church, with the area from Anthony's chapter relegated as the Old Chapel, with a new, gigantic, larger chapel overtaking it. After arriving, a priest is killed, and much like in Anthony's chapter, he has a large hole in his chest, a sign that bone thieves are amok. Paul is blamed and arrested on suspicion of his involvement, but befriends the chapel custodian, who reveals the dead monk was investigating the goings-on in the church and asks Paul to continue his work. Heresy is a very exploration-heavy chapter. Entrance to the underground is gated by a secret switch and finding 3 gems to open it up, and Paul will be asked with exploring every inch looking for sheet music for the piano as well. Paul also gains the shield spell, which needs no introduction, the 5-point power circle for casting stronger spells, and summon zombie, which again, no introduction. Upon reaching the sealed old tower, Paul runs into a familiar face, Anthony, who has become entirely zombified and seemingly incapable of saying anything but Charlemagne. Anthony is very strong and aggressive, on top of standing up after his first defeat to go again. Once Anthony is defeated for real, Paul gains his memories and realizes what he's gone through, praying for his soul, which is a nice moment that says a lot about Paul without needing to outright say it. After proving the conspiracy, the custodian supplies Paul with a sacrificial dagger, although he's unsure of its use. In the lower levels of the church, there's a tomb that is said to resemble the custodian with a dagger-sized slot in it. Inserting the knife opens the big door, which leads to an altar where the custodian lies dead, apparently due to Paul stabbing the tomb. While it was pretty obvious what would happen from the moment the tomb was found, it's still a really good moment to be forced to kill one of the only friendly faces the game ever has. After seeing this, Paul's desperate to end the heresy once and for all and chases a monk to the Binding Hall, where he runs into the Black Guardian, a creature summoned by Pius to guard one of the essences, that differs depending on the route. In Chattur'gha, he appears to be a giant lobster-like monster, in Ulyaoth it's a 3-legged jellyfish thing, and in Xel'lotath it's a headless, four-armed, lanky woman. Regardless of its form, the Black Guardian will immediately smash Paul Luther into pieces. While happy endings aren't expected for this game, it's easily the most gruesome death, and it happens to a main character no less. Paul does manage in his short time to become one of the most endearing characters, probably due to at least briefly having someone to play off of, so his death will actually hurt a little. Despite expectations that one may have going into the game that it'll be a campy mess like most horror games, it's actually a really solidly written piece of work for the most part, and it might be the best Lovecraftian game ever made due to truly capturing the themes of sanity and the fear of the unknown that the game loves so much. Back in the present, Alex finds a note telling her that she'll need to find 88 keys to get to the next chapter piece. After playing the musical piece from Paul's chapter, the Forbidden City begins. As the chapter name implies, it's a return to Persia, 1460. Roberto Bianchi is a traveling architect who is captured by a disguised Pius and thrown into the now crumbling ruins of the Forbidden City, told that when he surveys the entire area, he'll be freed. This introduces something of a new mechanic, as certain rooms Roberto passes through will need to be surveyed in order to complete the chapter, although the mechanic has little depth outside of simply pressing B in designated areas. Despite its disrepair, there are some other human slaves down here, none as talkative as the custodian, but at least Roberto isn't fully alone. Roberto also happens to perhaps be the worst character in the game with low magic, sanity, speed, and stamina, and he's only made even remotely tolerable with his enormous health bar. As with last time, the Forbidden City has new areas, but it doesn't feel like quite the upgrade, as this chapter is moderately boring. There's not a lot of story or drive, just surveying rooms and fighting enemies until it's over. The most interesting events are what Pius seeks to accomplish, building the Tower of Flesh, a monumental sacrifice to Pius's chosen ancient, hundreds of bodies stacked up and then cemented in place, which can first be seen in game depicted on a sketch in the room where Alex finds the Tome of Eternal Darkness. Midway through, Roberto also meets Kareem's ghost, who passes the essence along to Roberto. The sapphire effigy is also here, which again comes into play in a little bit. In the heart of the Forbidden City, Roberto finds a seemingly endless pit, and when he approaches, sanity-draining worms appear, although they can just be hit with any attack to remove them. After surveying every spot, Roberto must slowly backtrack to the start of the level, which feels fillery. Pleased with his work, Pius decides to make Roberto one member of his Pillar of Flesh. This is the definite low point of the game. Roberto's chapter is devoid of much besides simply making sure to check every room for survey points. It lacks puzzles, Roberto is a bad character to play as, and it isn't interesting enough to make up for it, and the chapter has very few story moments either. It can only go up from here. And by up, I mean the next interlude requires Alex to survey the corner of the room she's already in to get the chapter page. But after that 10-second waste of time, the game is actually on the upswing, with a war to end all wars. As its title implies, the year is 1916, the heart of the First World War, and a church in France has been turned into an Allied hospital. While the area of the church hasn't expanded in the years since Paul was there, it's received a large overhaul, with medical tents filling the main hall, supplies crowding every room, and the constant sounds and flashes of explosions rocking the church. Peter Jacobs is a reporter on the front lines, and letters written by soldiers he finds around the church hint at things not having changed much in the last 500 years, as the soldiers are reporting their wounded comrades disappearing in the night, presumably for use as an offering to the still-present Black Guardian. A running theme in the game is that the church levels are some of the best in the game, which continues here. Early in the chapter, a stray bomb will strike the church, causing a power outage that Peter will need to fix with a few fairly clever puzzles. Bone thieves are almost a constant in this chapter, constantly filling the main hall, which can be tense but not unfair, especially as, being World War I, Peter finally has access to usable firearms if needed. The final magical circle, the 7 point, is obtained here, and the piano returns one last time, which is a shame since its musical piece is really nice. Peter eventually winds up in the same basement of the church, and while clearing rooms of enemies, finds magical elixirs that fully recover magic instantly, which are a not so subtle hint about what's to come, and the magical attack spell, an area of attack damaging blast, they'll be very necessary for our first boss fight of 2, the Black Guardian. Regardless of its appearance, the Black Guardian will attack by constantly summoning zombies, lobbing fireballs, and smashing. Eventually the Black Guardian will flash the color of its alignment, meaning Peter can quickly use a magical attack to get a hit in. The boss battle isn't bad, it fits the gameplay style of the game, but it's a bit underwhelming when the best strategy is to mindlessly sprint back and forth until the Black Guardian makes itself vulnerable. In each route, the fight is slightly different, which is nice. The prior description was mostly for Chattur'gha. Ulyaoth's Black Guardian has slightly different magic attacks, which don't change much, and also hitting him with the magic attack seems to work a little less consistently for some reason, while Xel'lotath's Guardian only uses magic attacks. Her stomp is replaced with a slow large beam, but her regular projectiles only drains sanity, and fires once instead of 4 times, so maybe she's easy mode. After the Black Guardian is defeated, Peter claims the essence, and many years later, an elderly Peter brings it to Edward, hoping that removing it from his life will allow him to sleep peacefully. And with that, we have another character who escapes mostly unscathed from his time with the Tome of Eternal Darkness. After completing the chapter, an item belonging to Peter falls out of the tome, and it's used in the same way to repair a fuse box, allowing Alex to enter the room that was allegedly too dark to be entered before, which has the chapter page for A Legacy of Darkness, Alex's grandfather Edwin Roivas' chapter. It's now 1952, the mansion is still staffed, but has certainly seen better days, although it's more or less in the same state as the modern day incarnations from the Alex interludes. In a callback to the start of the game, Max tells Edward to set the clocks to 3:33, but to do so, he'll have to find the clock's hand. It's cool to see a game actually go out of its way to contextualize and call back its puzzles. Edward also finds the Magic Pool spell, which continuously regenerates the matching alignment for some time, but when paired with the Mantarok alignment, it'll continuously regenerate all 3, meaning it's essentially a free spell as it'll eventually restore its own magic costs and then some. After getting Magic Pool, there's no reason not to have it running constantly. It's pretty much the best spell in the game. Despite starring Edward, this chapter has an incredibly strange focus on combat. After getting the Tome of Eternal Darkness, a vampire begins harassing the staff. This unique enemy will be fought off, go to heal, and repeat a few times. If Edward can save the staff, they'll reward him with ammunition and other small rewards, including the elephant gun. Eventually, he can move to the basement and smash the vampire's obelisk to prevent it from healing, then murder it, grab Summon Horror, which is self-explanatory, and go under the mansion. Edward will go deeper into Xel'lotath than Max could, finding the giant circle of power that runs the city. The latter half of Edward's level is teleporting to all the towers, setting up the gigantic Dispel Magic spell, then fighting a lot of enemies to return to the teleporter. While I think the combat in the game is decent, doing 9 combat arenas back to back to back to back gets a little tedious, especially because some of the rooms are actually fairly difficult, like the one with the Horror and the Guardian together. The power of the giant dispel magic spell deals a huge blow to the city, but it's clear this isn't enough to stop the forces of darkness, only slow them. 48 years later, Edward is in his library when a guardian appears behind him, leading directly into the start of the game. While there are some solid things in the chapter, like seeing the giant spell go off and the cyclical things that play into the beginning, its combat focus makes it pretty underwhelming. Alex's next interlude shows the rising stakes, as the mansion is now inhabited by zombies and bone thieves in the present. Edward has left a note for Alex because the designers couldn't find a better way to get Alex to the basement, guiding her to a pickaxe she can use to finally access the sealed servant chambers. Here we finally see why Max was locked up, as his paranoia caused him to murder his whole staff. Despite his want to tell the world of the approaching darkness, the insanity had crept in and overtaken him. It's a nice layer to his character. In the servant chamber, Alex gets a stethoscope she uses to crack the safe in the basement in a minigame that's kind of frustrating due to the rotation, sometimes moving 2 clicks instead of 1. The essence Peter retrieved as well as the final chapter page are inside. Ashes to Ashes returns to Persia in 1991 during the Gulf War, making this probably modern day Kuwait. Michael Edwards is a military firefighter, and while attempting to put out an oil rig fire is caught in an explosion that kills his team and drops him next to the buried and forgotten pillar of flesh. It's also worth noting that he was originally going to be a soldier, but then 9/11 happened, and yeah. Roberto's ghost appears, delivering the effigies and the final essence to Michael. Due to the modern setting, Michael has almost immediate access to a variety of weapons, like a machine gun that can be shot in single or burst fire, or used as a grenade launcher. This is perhaps the first gun I'd consider better than melee, as it doesn't need to reload often, and even when it needs to, it reloads fast. The burst fire and grenade tear through enemies, but the cramped areas of the Forbidden City make the splash damage from the grenade almost guaranteed. Michael also has a lapel flashlight, meaning it can be used alongside a weapon, which is really convenient. There's another Indiana Jones reference here, where Michael uses a stick and amulet to shine a light onto a miniature city, but this time it's a small mirror puzzle. Michael finds the final effigy and can use them to get the optional weapon, the Enchanted Gladius, which he can't personally use. Michael gets the final spell here, Bind, which can turn enemies into allies temporarily, usually just to make enemies behind barriers fight each other. Michael also finds C4, and by powering it up with Enhance Item, he can destroy the Forbidden City, but he must escape in 3 minutes before the blast goes off. At this point, the game throws every enemy it's got at him to slow him down. This chapter is mostly combat focused, but its puzzle elements, spectacle, and top tier weapons make it far more bearable than the others. It's a cathartic late game release to have such powerful weapons. After his escape, Michael tracks down Edward and gives him a package containing something from the Forbidden City before disappearing into the night. It's weird that he does this, as the essence and Gladius aren't hidden away by Edward like the others, but are delivered later in the next interlude. This may be a plot hole caused by a hasty rewrite, or it may have been a setup for the sequel later. Unless I'm to believe Edward mailed the package to his own home right before he died, and that it took 2 weeks to arrive, when in reality USPS would take months. I'd like to put another spoiler warning here. This section and the next are the end of the game. Play this game, please. The final chapter, Gateway to Destiny, as it should, follows Alex, modern day, being 2000, because that's when the game takes place. There's a light puzzle reminiscent of the one in Michael's chapter, opening the path to Enga for Alex. In the lobby, a package is delivered containing the final essence, and if all 3 effigies are found, the Enchanted Gladius. It's no different from a regular Gladius, outside of having a permanent dominant enchantment on it. It's useful as enchanting items during the final battle with Pius is pretty tough, but it's certainly not necessary. Pius is well on his way to summoning his chosen ancient, and in order to counter this, Alex needs to relight the 9-point circle to summon the dominant ancient. Thankfully, as opposed to combat, she instead has small puzzle segments, such as dodging invisible trappers, putting monsters in cages, and so on. It's still fairly tedious, but not to the same extent. Once the summon spell's done, Pius and Alex's ancients begin to fight, and Alex and Pius also begin their fight. The battle is even more underwhelming than the Black Guardian, as the fight consists of throwing the Gladius at Pius, attacking his chosen essence and repeating until the essence is destroyed, then wailing on Pius until he dies. While the battle itself is lame, there is a nice moment where Ellie awakens in the dimension of the Tome of Eternal Darkness, and after every hit, Alex will temporarily become the ghost of a dead tome bearer, cycling through them all except Lindsay, Peter, Michael, Edward, and obviously Pius. It's cheesy and dumb, but it's also a perfect end cap for all the storylines, especially given the overarching theme the game has, that humanity is too weak to fight the ancients alone, but by fighting together, even across thousands of years, they manage to do it. There's also heavy themes of sacrifice for the greater good mixed in with characters like Kareem and Elia. After Pius is killed and his ancient is defeated, it dawns on Alex that summoning a different ancient wasn't a much better plan. Thankfully, Edward's ghost comes up with a plan to turn the giant power circle into a binding spell as a temporary solution. While the last chapter isn't great in gameplay, I really like its somewhat dour ending, as not much has been done besides slowing down the impending doom, but that isn't the end of the story yet. After completion, a new game plus of sorts is unlocked. While powers unfortunately don't carry over, in Chapter 1, Pius's previous essence choice will be missing, forcing him to choose another. As said before, this causes enemies to change, but also changes various cutscenes. The player also unlocks the ability to skip previously seen cutscenes, although new cutscenes are unskippable. But there are some nice changes, such as the different power dynamics between Pius and his chosen ancient in each scenario. Some cutscenes are still unskippable though, despite only having a differently colored enemy or something else minor than that, which is pretty silly. After each playthrough, the player unlocks a new feature too. First time credits, which no thanks, already sat through them once. Second time chapter select, and third time eternal mode, which is a god mode with unlimited health, sanity, magic, and ammo and guns. After completing the game for a third time, a new secret ending is unlocked, revealing that each playthrough has happened simultaneously in different dimensions. The Tome of Eternal Darkness was created by Mantarok, and he used it to guide his pawns to destroy the other ancients. Despite this, Mantarok is still bound and dying, and his motivation is unclear, whether it was benevolence to humans, purely revenge, or leaving himself as the last ancient so he could take over.
Only Mantarok remains, slowly dying. Mantarok, Keeper, Overseer, Warden of Ancients, Chaos, an entity trapped between the veils of reality and the enchanted stakes that impale its flesh.
Well, the epilogue says he's still plotting, implying the latter. We'll never truly know, as, despite how great the game was, and its immensely good reception, Eternal Darkness' legacy would be a story of failure. The game was not a financial success, and while being conceived as a trilogy, has remained a one-off, without so much as a re-release. Leaks and information on the death of Silicon Knights show that Eternal Darkness 2 was finally set to see the light of day as an early title for the Wii U, and was apparently a decent amount into production before Silicon Knights would be destroyed by their lawsuit with Epic, causing the game to quietly die. But even if it had released, it's doubtful it would have done well with the Wii U of all things either. Nintendo still holds and renews the trademark for Eternal Darkness, even on the Switch, and Alex appears in Smash Ultimate as a spirit, showing Nintendo clearly has some interest in the series still. Silicon Knights wouldn't give up on the idea entirely though, as its successor Precursor games would have one of the more disastrous Kickstarter failures in history. Shadows of the Eternals was set to be a spiritual successor to Eternal Darkness, but was plagued with issues, including multiple failed rounds on crowdfunding sites. After closing down their campaigns with a promise of a relaunch soon, one of the founding members of Silicon Knights and Precursor Games, as well as the co-designer of Eternal Darkness, would go to jail for watching cuties. Would go to jail for something I definitely cannot say on YouTube. Despite this, the Kickstarter got its third relaunch, and apparently had support from Nintendo in some capacity. After the failure of the third Kickstarter, the game and Precursor Games itself would die. This led to another new company, Quantum Entanglement Entertainment, which also had intentions of trying Shadows of the Eternal again. It would then die. The final studio, Apocalypse Studios, which still has a lot of Silicon Knights blood in it, is actually launching a game soon, a successor to writer Diak's earlier work, Legacy of Kain. While the future is uncertain, it's possible that if Dead House Sonata works out, we could eventually see Shadow of the Eternals, or even a return to Eternal Darkness, given Nintendo's interest. The game is very strong narratively and thematically. It's obviously incredibly Lovecraftian, exploring similar themes of the unknown and how small humanity truly is. The point is reinforced through the gameplay, as none of the characters can accomplish much alone, but instead only by working together across literally thousands of years. It's really cleverly written, with its structure of a giant plot, smaller locational plots, and individual plots. It can at times feel disjointed, and not every chapter is a winner, but a good majority of the game all comes together pretty well. It's an impressive feat to make 12 vignettes and have them intersect and come together. The gameplay is fairly solid, nothing crazy, but experimenting with spells is fun and the combat is certainly passable. The sanity effects are the obvious highlight, as even near the end and knowing what's coming, it's still incredibly confusing and honestly stressful to watch a character explode from a healing spell, and they can also be genuinely cool and weird outside of that, and it's just something that hasn't really been recreated. The game is unique, and for its time, it still holds up visually. The game is just really great and I can't recommend experiencing it enough. I'm not great at conclusions, but I hope I've kinda highlighted why I think Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem is really fucking cool.